Hello, everybody, and a warm welcome to this event at the Lockdown LitFest. But Charles Cumming is the author of the Alec Milius books and the Thomas Kell books, A Foreign Country, A Colder War, and A Divided Spy, as well as the New York Times best-selling thriller The Trinity Six and others, only tells half the story. That he writes for the Emmy Award-winning, or wrote for the Emmy Award-winning AMC TV miniseries The Night Manager gets a little bit deeper into his writing career. That he has a large and loyal audience, that he's been translated into 14 languages, and that he was the sports and film writer for The Week begins to give us a shape and form of the career of the man who is also a trustee of the Pierce Lochran Memorial Scholarship Fund, which provides tuition fees for the Yates Summer Schools in Sligo, and is the founder and president of the Jose Raul Capablanca Memorial Chess Society. Allows me to say, Charles Cumming, a man of diverse talents, a very warm welcome to the Lockdown LitFest. Charles, first of all, how are you? How are you surviving lockdown? And where in the world are you?
Paul, hello. It's good. Thanks for having me on. I feel as though lockdown ended round about the time that Dominic Cummings had his eyes tested. I've already been to Madrid. I was in Madrid for about 10 days last week. You walk around London, I've been in restaurants and trains and so forth. I mean, it feels in West London fairly normal now. I guess the first couple of months were strange. I imagine you've had a lot of writers on LitFest who have complained about inspiration during lockdown and finding the creative process quite tricky because there's so much time that you can sort of expand your work into that time, and yet the outside world, at least in April and May, was so unusual and so compelling that anything fictional that you could come up with didn't really compare. At least that was my take on it.
So it's not been fertile ground for you for writing?
No, it has. I've actually done quite a lot. I've done a good chunk of the sequel to my new book, Box 88. I wouldn't say it's been easy, but I never really find writing easy anyway. It's I'm not one of these guys who kind of hits his desk at 8 o'clock in the morning and has done 3,000 words before lunch. I mean, I find it quite difficult. But no, I can't complain. It's been no different to the usual rhythm of my writing days.
You read English literature at Edinburgh. In fact, you got a first-class honours. You nailed that. Were you always going to be a writer? Was that always the ambition? Did you come from a bookish family?
I don't come from a bookish family at all, but writing was the only thing that I could do. Literally, I mean, I'm not being falsely modest. I was mathematically hugely incompetent, bad at languages. I'm economically illiterate, but I could always put sentences together. So I was encouraged by various teachers and by my father to pursue a career in writing. And then age 25, I think, so a long time ago, I had this very brief encounter with MI6, which I fictionalized into my first novel, A Spy by Nature. So this hugely kind of dramatic, or potentially dramatic story kind of landed in my lap and was just sort of crying out to be written. So I was very fortunate. And as you mentioned in your preview, I was working at the same time of The Week, so The Week was sort of paying my mortgage, and I was sort of struggling along with the books. One thing I will correct is that I didn't actually write on The Night Manager. I was in the writer's room for a potential second season for about 6 months, but it didn't come to anything. So just to correct that.
Thank you for the correction. I'm sorry I got that wrong.
No. It's there's a lot of I even just this morning I got a tweet saying, "How's the second season going?" And I said, "I have no idea."
You mentioned the thing which is a good starting point for anybody who's looking to write fiction, especially spy fiction, that you were approached for recruitment. You had a meeting, or not a meeting, but you were sort of touched on the shoulder by MI6. How did that come about? I mean, we hear of the famous sort of clasp on the shoulder when at Cambridge. How did it work for you?
So I had been at Edinburgh University, and I was home for the weekend with my mother and my late stepfather, and they had a friend who came for dinner, who, long story short, put me up for it. He said he'd recently retired from the Foreign Office, the diplomatic service, but it turned out latterly, obviously, that he'd been in SIS, the Secret Intelligence Service, and he, I guess, sort of tapped me on the shoulder like the cut of my jib, whatever these different euphemisms are, and a letter arrives, and I went for various interviews and exams and so forth in central London, and nothing came of it. But this material, as I mentioned before, that landed in my lap was sort of crying out to be dramatized. So A Spy by Nature was a story of Alec Milius, who was a sort of version of me, I suppose, if I had gone into that world, and the price I may or may not have paid in terms of my relationship with my then girlfriend, and with my friends and with my family, and just the what would have been the psychological impact really of going into the secret world at a comparatively tender age. I think Alec is what, 25, 26 in A Spy by Nature, a tiny bit older in The Spanish Game.
Yes, a flawed learner in his early 20s. Can we unpack this a little bit? If my memory serves, I saw an early draft of A Spy by Nature when it had its original working title, which, if memory serves, Charles, was Peripheral Vision, which I still think is a cracking title. Am I remembering that correctly?
You are. That's amazing. You remember that. I think it was pointed out to me by Roland White, who's my editor at Penguin, at Michael Joseph, that it sounded like the autobiography of a optometrist, peripheral vision. So he was more interested in selling books, weirdly. So he said, this is a spy novel. And in those days, the spy novel was sort of a dead genre. It was about 1998, 99 when I'd finished writing the first draft of Spy by Nature. So there was no, there had been no 9/11. There was, the Soviet Union was defunct. It was quite difficult to sell espionage fiction. So he wanted to put spy in the title, which actually proved to be a very good bit of business.
A very good bit of business. Had you been a fan of spy fiction up to that? Had you read Fleming? Had you read the other people that had worked in this field?
I had read, after what happened to me with MI6, I read a lot of Le Carre.
Right.
But not Dayton. I'd read Green, but not really the Green spy novels. I came to Eric Ambler much later, who's the sort of grandfather of the serious political spy thriller. He wrote, you know this, Coffin for Demetrius, or Mask of Demetrius, and so Journey to Fear and all this. But no, I wasn't really an aficionado. I still, to this day, there's a great guy who's the reviewer for the Times, thriller reviewer for the Times, Jeremy Duns, who lives in Scandinavia. And if ever I have a question about spy fiction, I just go to the Oracle. I just email Jeremy Duns and say, in Len Dayton, I don't know it as intimately perhaps as I should.
What's our fascination? I mean, it's now, you've carved out a hell of a niche, and people are fascinated by the inner workings of espionage. Every Bond film, every Bourne film, Jason Bourne film, gets a huge amount of audience. There is this fascination for what goes on the other side of the veiled curtain. What do you put that down to?
I think it's to do with the double life. I think it's to do with lying. I think it's to do with the secrecy inside all of us. I think was it Garcia Marquez who said people have. I've forgotten the quote, but basically everybody has a secret life as well as a sort of a professional face and a face that they project to their friends and their family. And so spy fiction, spy movies kind of tap into that. At the same time, they're also very exciting. So you mentioned the Bond movies or the Bond books or the Bourne franchise. I mean, there's few things I think is exciting in cinema in the last 20 years as the Bourne Ultimatum and the sequence of Waterloo Station and so forth. It's the sense of intense jeopardy, but also of mass surveillance. I think that's accounted for the popularity, certainly, of the spy movie in the last 15 years. There's Google and number plate recognition cameras and CCTV everywhere, and the idea that, I'm conducting this interview with you staring at an iPhone screen, that our conversation can be picked up by some nice chap in Beijing or Tehran or Moscow, and they know exactly where we are. They can listen to us, they can hear us, our bank records, our phone records, everything is being filed, so to speak. And people in the 21st century are well aware of this. We just had the Russia report released yesterday in the UK. So I think the combination of the sort of psychological interest in the double life, in all of us telling lies of varying degrees of intensity, and taking on different personalities, lying for one's country or lying for one's personal benefit, all of these things have made the spy narrative popular for more than 100 years.
Is this the aspect that you alluded to when you were touched on the shoulder, to use the euphemism, about the difficulties it would have led to you personally, or it would have risen for you personally in conducting espionage as a career? The fact you would have had to lie to your family, to those closest to you. You seem to hint towards that in your earlier answer.
Yeah, I think that I can remember feeling that way, that it would have, I would have been uncomfortable with it. I lack what Graham Greene called the sort of sliver of ice in the heart. You know, I'm not that competitive or ruthless, and I think you do need to have a degree of that to be a successful intelligence officer. I'm not saying you need to be a sociopath, but it helps to be on that scale to a certain extent. I'm not saying I'm like Mr. Nice Guy, but I just, in terms of what would have been required of me, sort of the discipline, the concentration, the ability to work in a team. Apart from anything else, I'm not sure I'm particularly a team player. I don't think I would have been particularly well cut out for that sort of a career, and I think they saw that very quickly. Even though I was, just a young drip of a lad, 25, yeah. 26.
Let's come to the writing of espionage then. What does it take to be a good espionage author in terms of research, in terms of understanding of the geopolitical situations you put your characters into? What does it take for you to understand the character about whom you're writing, whether it's Milius or any of them?
Do you know what, Paul? My answer to that is, I think people have such vast, wide-ranging taste in fiction that I no longer really believe there's such a thing as a good or a bad writer. I think that certain people can read a book which, to me, would have really appalling sentences and sort of narrative structure and so forth. But to somebody else, that will be a work of great merit and award-winning prose and so forth. So it's really in the lap of the gods, of the lap of the readership. I mean, if they believe that what they're reading is a good story, a good yarn with good characters, then I suppose I've done my job, or any author has done his or her job. But I used to have this idea that there was such a thing as a good sentence or a well-turned paragraph. I no longer believe that. Obviously, I aspire to it, but whether it makes any difference to a reader is entirely in their hands. So another way of saying that would be that to answer more directly your question, yes. I mean, I think it's extremely important to be psychologically accurate about the way that these people think and operate, and the dangers that they face, and the being swamped by surveillance and so forth, and to be as up to date and realistic as possible. But readers don't, as far as I can tell, a lot of readers don't need that. All that they need really is a compelling narrative, a compelling story with interesting characters and away they go. And whether or not it's expressed in a way that you and I would think was fluent or interesting is of secondary importance.
Let's take Typhoon as an example then. It was listed by New York Times as one of the 100 notable books of the year of its publication. Rather presciently, it's a political thriller about a CIA plot to destabilize China. And it mentions the Uyghurs, a lot of things that are very current today. Can we talk a little bit about how you research and how you give your books this sense of verisimilitude of how this might be happening, how there may be a sense of reality in the fictional narrative that you are focusing on?
Well, the Xinjiang situation in Typhoon came about from conversations that I had while I was in Beijing researching the book. I spoke to a guy who's called Oliver August, who was the Times correspondent there. He was the sort of primary person who put me onto this. But what you could probably call the problem, the Uyghur problem, has been going on in China since the time of Deng Xiaoping. And what you see now is a far worse, more hideous version of what was happening 10, 15 years ago. In other words, fake accusations of terrorist outrages, the erasing of the deliberate erasing of an entire culture, Turkic Muslim Uyghur culture in China, in order to what's called the Hunification of China. President Xi now has the power to push ahead with what previous administrations in Beijing have been quietly doing for years. But the re-education camps and the idea of sterilization and so forth, this is all new, and this is a live. It's not a genocide exactly, but it's the single most appalling things I can in global affairs. And I'm very glad, actually, I'm no fan at all of the Boris Johnson government, but at least Raab and the British government have made it clear that they are outraged by what's going on in Xinjiang, and at least the ghastly Pompeo and Trump have pushed back a little bit against China and said, "Hang on, this is too much." But whether or not that will make a iota of difference to the well-being of particularly, actually, it's men and women now in Xinjiang, Uyghurs, I don't know. But it's but yeah, I suppose I had no idea they would get as bad as it's got. And I feel there's honestly, this sounds ridiculous, but there's honestly days where I think I would be better served the next 20 years trying to do something about that situation rather than writing stories, just sort of try and create some sort of movement or global awareness about the atrocities that are occurring in Xinjiang, because it's really awful. It cannot be understated. It's just an awful situation.
Well, it's the role of the fiction writer, surely, part of the role of the fiction writer, apart from selling books, entertaining readers, to open worlds to readers that they may not be aware of. Is that a responsibility that you take on board, that through espionage fiction you are shining the torch into some fairly dark corners and shining light into areas that people ought to know about, that our governments may be working on? Is that something you factor into your writing?
Well, again, I've kind of shifted on that I used to believe in my naivety in my kind of 30s that to write about these issues, to write about political issues, or to shine a light, as you say, onto human rights abuses or any kind of political mendacity was a useful and kind of noble pursuit, and that readers would appreciate that. But I never have the sense that whatever political content may or may not be contained in my books has any impact on readers at all. I think, again, I come back to what I said before, what people seem to want more than anything is story and suspense and character, and that possibly with good reason that they feel swamped by too much information. And as soon as you go on Twitter or Facebook or turn on the news, 24-hour news cycles, there's just Trump, Brexit, Dominic Cummings, China. I mean, people are saturated in politics, and so perhaps fiction is not the place to be discussing. Although, having said that, I'm not going to give up. Maybe when I'm kind of older and more distinguished, people will pay attention. But at the moment, I don't feel it makes any difference at all, frankly. So I'm sounding very cynical this morning, but that's just how I feel.
That's absolutely fine. Cynical. We're very happy with cynical. How do you research subjects? How do you get stuck in? I was thinking, I know that you lived in Barcelona for quite some time, and I assume you wrote the Spanish Game, which was the return of the anti-hero Alec Milius, and it's centered on ETA and a Basque paramilitary nationalist organization. How do you get into the research to give the fiction the impression? I mean, obviously people can understand that these are works of fiction, but they're based in a sense of reality.
So, I mean, I did live in Spain. I was more in Madrid than in Barcelona, and I spoke to people then, as I've done for all of my books. So I have people in the secret world who have helped me. So with sort of tradecraft, or with the way in which an intelligence service would or would not be thinking about a particular problem, so they'll steer me in that way without obviously breaching the Secrets Act. There's a huge amount of stuff that's publicly available in book form or on the internet about intelligence work, far more than there was 20 years ago or longer. I mean, the espionage in the 21st century is a very different beast to what she was in the 20th century, where the existence of MI5, the existence of GCHQ and MI6 was denied. Stella Remington found herself on the front pages of every newspaper in the Western world in the mid-1990s when she was publicly revealed as the head of the security service. But up to that point, these people they lived in the shadows. They were deniable. But in the age of Snowden and the lovely Assange and WikiLeaks, we are all sort of bit part players in a vast kind of global spy drama, not least because we have phones and laptops and Wi-Fi and all the rest of it, which is connecting us potentially to anybody who might want to take an interest in what we're doing. And obviously all of so much of counterterrorism these days is conducted through surveillance. So following somebody's phone, listening to their movements on their phone, listening to their conversations, seeing what they're texting, what they're writing, what they're hiding in the dark web or whatever. So again, in terms of research, if I need to know something, I know people that I can go to and ask, or I know where to find those books or those articles on the internet. But also, so much of it is just imagination, and my job is to tell interesting stories and to propel the plot along. So I think if I was absolutely entirely accurate all the time to the business of spying, I'd never get past page 10. I've got to get the cat off the mat and make him do something rather than just sit on the mat.
Has the increasing technology made writing spy fiction more difficult or less difficult? It's obviously changed it. No longer can we have the loose brick and the chalk mark as an act of tradecraft, although of course it still exists. But as you say,
I think what it's done is it sort of slowed you down in one respect and it sped you up in another. So you can make an awful lot more happen narratively now because of texting, because of the information that's readily available on the internet about a certain individual. For example, you can track somebody down, but on the other side, you can't isolate them. You can't put a protagonist even on a mountainside and isolate them, because they're always going to be able to get some signal or some help from somewhere. So and obviously a great part of jeopardy is not being able to tell anybody how frightened you are or the circumstances that you are in. But if you're trapped somewhere and you have a mobile phone, then you're going to be out in 6 hours. So one of the solutions I've come up with is my new book, Box 88, takes place in a dual timeline. So there's a contemporary spy story set in 2019, 2020, but it flashes back to 1989. And part of the reason I did that, apart from just sort of show how much the world has changed in the last 30 years, is because there was no tech in 1989. So I have my very young spy, Lachlan Kite, in Box 88 in 1989, doing a very difficult job, but he can't text for advice, or he can't make a kind of quiet phone call on his iPhone to his handler. He is alone in a small house in the south of France doing what he's been asked to do, but without any of the he's planting a microphone. But in those days, in order to plant a bug, you needed to have a power source going into a bug, so you had to sort of plug it into the wall, that sort of thing, or the battery would run out in 6 hours. I mean, all those sort of things that nowadays we take for granted. I can sort of pick up a set of car keys and put them down in somebody's house and they'd work for a year and pick up everything they said. But back then, no. And so in terms of storytelling, that's quite interesting, because it's old school Moscow rules, chalk mark on walls, as opposed to there's a satellite up there and there's a phone over there and there's a laptop in this corner, all of which is cramping me for space in terms of what I can and cannot do with a story.
We'll talk more about Box 88 in a second. Can we circle back to the introduction of Thomas Kell? I'm intrigued to know, having set your stall out with Milius, who was a fantastic character, and I'm not saying Thomas Kell is a less fantastic character at all, he is also a fantastic character, but how big a shift that was for you to get your mind out of one central protagonist and introduce your audience to another?
It's a good question. There was two things, really, because there was also a writing thing. The Milius books are first person, sort of present continuous tense. So you're inside Alec's head for those two books, which is, on the one hand, very interesting, because you can hear every thought and every impulse that he has, but it's quite difficult to do suspense because you don't know who is ranged against him. You can't do the man waiting around the corner for him, or the train that might hit him if he crosses that road. So I was doing more kind of traditional third person pass with Kell, but I was also jumping from a guy who was an outsider, Milius, to Kell, who had worked in the service for 20 years and was an intelligence officer of great longevity and experience. So I had never done what Kell has done, and so I was relying very much on my imagination, but also on people helping me and saying he would do this, he wouldn't do that. And this is why the best spy novelists usually, so with Fleming or Le Carre or Green, they have some experience of Somerset Maugham, some experience of that world which they can draw on. And I have relied on others who have experience of that world to tell me about it.
Are they free with their information? How does that transaction work?
I would say they're definitely not free with the information, no. And it's usually a sort of, I might get a sort of yes/no answer rather than a detailed account of how a particular service would behave in a set of circumstances. But actually, I have needed them less and less, partly just because I've sort of gathered so much information over the last 20 years, but also because, I mean, even if you watch that fabulous French TV series, The Bureau, I don't know if you know that, that's very, very accurate to the business of contemporary intelligence work and Knox and so forth. So I could probably just watch The Bureau forever and never have to speak to another intelligence officer again.
You admire those people who do work in this field?
Yeah, I think like any huge organization, my impression is that there are very, very impressive people who do extraordinary work, and then there are less impressive people, and you think, how did they end up here? And some are cut out for it, and some are not. But there's no doubt about it that even just the sort of patriotic urge, the desire to make the world a better place that typically you might feel in your 20s or early 30s is an admirable, noble reason to go into that line of work and to protect people, particularly in the kind of post 9/11 world in which we live. To keep people like me and you safe in our beds and my children, so is wonderful. So I admire them, and then in sort of intellectually, operationally, I don't have that much detailed knowledge of what they may or may not have done. But there have been people I've met who have been some of the cleverest, sharpest people I've ever come across, and others I've thought, I would wonder why. So you often hear people say that somebody can go through an entire career in MI6 without making a meaningful recruitment, and then another officer will be picking people up, a couple of people every month. So it's a talent and an aptitude for something, just like anything else, just like sports or banking or medicine or whatever.
We'll talk a little bit about adaptation. I know that you adapted Trinity 6 into a screenplay. I know there was talk of A Foreign Country, which concerned the disappearance of the first female chief of MI6, which is a 2012 book. I understood that was being developed into a TV series, and Colin Firth, I think, was the name associated with it. Where are you with adaptations? How do you feel about them?
So I'm not sure that basically A Foreign Country, the rights are owned by a company that is owned by Colin Firth. And it's now in development with a major American broadcaster. I'm not sure I'm allowed to say any more than that because I'm not sure it's been announced. Okay. So fingers crossed. I know that they found a writer. But fingers crossed that A Foreign Country at least will find its way to a screen sometime in the next 2-3 years. But as you will know from all of these conversations with lots of writers over the years, the process of film development is geologically slow.
Yeah.
And I sold the rights to A Foreign Country 10 years ago, and it was initially a feature film, and then I wrote a draft for a pilot episode, and now my impression is that they want to make it as much about Amelia Levine, who's the female head of MI6 that you referenced, as about Kel. So it'll be very much a two-hander, concentrating possibly more on her, and this is really her story in the first book.
Yep.
And then A Spy by Nature has been in development since about 1874, but they're still talking about making that into a film. So I'm leaning on wood now as I speak to you, touching it constantly.
Good luck with that. Would you like to see them adapted? A lot of authors, of course, have a very difficult relationship with adaptations of their work. What's your view on it?
Funny. I mean, I can understand that if somebody makes a bad film, just a flat out bad film of a book, then the writer is going to be upset because there's an opportunity there to make a good film and they messed it up. And I think it can, if you have a real stinker, it can have an effect on the writer's reputation with subsequent novels that they may write. But I've always been of the view that the book will always be there. If they made a film of the Trinity 6, for example, there's the book of the Trinity 6, and then there would be the film or television adaptation, and never the twain shall meet. So I'm not precious about what they may or may not do with my stuff, as long as they do it sensibly and intelligently. I'm a great believer that that you can always improve on an idea, and that somebody might think Charles wasn't having a very good day that day because that plot turn is not as good as my idea for this plot turn, and it might turn out to be better. So it's well worth listening to those people. They might be wrong, but they also might improve your stuff. So no, I hope that they get adapted, but I hope that they get adapted well.
We keep our fingers crossed for that. I shall start touching wood for you as well. Let's come to Box 88, which is the latest novel, which is due out in October, and which introduces us to a new character, Lachlan Kite, another new character. Who is he? What does he represent?
So Lockie is a kind of working class Scottish boy whose mother runs a little hotel on the west coast of Scotland in the 1980s. His father is an alcoholic who died when Lockie was 11. So he's an only child being raised by a quite tricky mother. And for various complicated reasons, she comes into some money and thinks that her son, who's bright and clever and will be sort of shrunk by sticking around the west of Scotland, she sends him off to an English boarding school in 1985. And that English boarding school is quite like Eton, geographically and in terms of how it operates.
Are we allowed to say where you went to school?
Where I went to school, yeah. So Lockie ends up at Alford College, and at Alford College is recruited into Box 88, which is a secret US-UK intelligence service, which sort of combines the best of the CIA and the best of MI6, but is unknown to either service, which is something that has always intrigued me, because there's people I've met in SIS who believe that such an agency does exist, that there's a sort of deep state within MI6 which is doing stuff above and beyond the call of duty, so to speak, with no oversight. So Kite is inculcated into Box 88, and the way that Box 88 the book works, and subsequent books in the series will work, is that you have Kite, who's now my age, sort of late 40s, who's at a very senior level at Box 88 in London, and something happens to him in the present day which forces him to look back on an operation in the past. So you get sort of two novels for the price of one, if you like, and one takes place in 89, and then the present day, and the one I'm doing now is 1993 in Russia, sort of post-Soviet Russia, with a contemporary storyline.
Sounds like a brilliant setup. And you perceive this as a series. We're going to see more of Lachlan Kite, or Lockie as we call him.
Yeah, no, he's going to be my. I'll be writing Kite books, I think, for the next 5-10 years. I mean, I've done so many standalones, and I think that it's really a commercial decision as much as anything else. Although creatively, I think it's easier to do a series because you know the characters, you know the milieu. You don't have to start with a totally blank page, as I did with, say, The Man Between or with Typhoon or 26. But I think also readers like the series. You know, they invest in a character. They want to know what happens to them next. You see this obviously with Lee Child or with Sherlock Holmes or whatever it might be, with Jack Reacher. So that's the idea, and to write more regularly than I have done in the past, to produce one of these books every year, so that more of my hair falls out, but at least I have a career by the time I'm 55. So that's the strategy.
Many years ago, I've been friends with Lee Child for a long time. We talked about Reacher over the last 20 years or so, and I was the first person to whom he revealed why Reacher was called Reacher. I was the first to ask him that question. Why is Kite called Kite? Because the importance of a name in your central protagonist in a series of novels featuring that protagonist is vitally important.
Yeah, and I realized that quite late. But with Kite, I knew enough. So it's the sense of somebody. So there's two things. Obviously, the kite, as in the kite runner, the flying off kites. The sense that he is slightly unmoored and a loner and moving around in that way, but also Kite, a bird of prey, rather sort of glamorous, rather beautiful bird, who's exactly a predator. So those two things were in my mind when but actually, and then the first name, and it might become a problem. It might be a stroke of genius, but I like the name Lachlan, even though it's spelled Lachlan, and there's and then there's an abbreviation Lockie, but it looks very good on the page. It's striking, and it's sort of classless in a country where to be called Charles or Paul or whatever, everybody can sort of point a finger at you, or they know a Paul, they know a Charles, whereas there aren't that many Lockies knocking about, and at least people will come to him with sort of fresh eyes. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know. I'm a huge fan of the name Lachlan myself. Bloody marvelous. I'm going to ask you a favor here. So nobody's heard or read, other than within the industry, anything about Lachlan Kite and Box 88 so far. Is that correct?
Correct, sir.
And yet I happen to know on your laptop to your right, you have a manuscript that has not yet really seen the light of day. Would you give us a world exclusive and read us the first couple of pages or an extract from the forthcoming Box 88 featuring Lachlan Kite?
Of course I will. I'd like to do that. How did you know that? You must have surveillance.
I have a camera within your camera, and I'm reading it as we speak. We had this conversation earlier, but thank you for maintaining the deceit. We're very grateful to you for giving us a world exclusive, please, Charles. Perhaps you'd like to introduce it for us.
Sure. So I'll just read the first chapter that features Kite himself, chapter 2 of Box 88. Which takes place in the present day. This is before we flash back to his youth and his indoctrination into Box 88 itself. Shall I just go ahead and do that now?
That would be very kind of you. Thank you, Charles.
Okay. I'm gonna move screens as well. Here we go. Hopefully you can cut this bit if I'm taking too long to get to the.
We'll keep it all in.
Okay.
It's all part of the magic of live.
Yeah. Right. Here we go. Lachlan Kite woke at sunrise, crept out of bed, changed into a pair of shorts and running shoes, and set out on a 4-mile loop around the hills encircling the cottage in Sussex. The news of Xavier's death had hit him as hard as anything he could recall since the sudden loss of Michael Strawson, his mentor and father figure, to a cancer of the liver which had ripped through him in the space of a few months. Though he had seen Xavier only fitfully over the previous 10 years, Kite felt a personal sense of responsibility for his death, which was as inescapable as it was illogical and undeserved. Usually, pounding the paths around the cottage, feeling the soft winter ground beneath his feet, he could switch the world off and gain respite from whatever problems or challenges might face him upon his return. Kite had run throughout his adult life in Voronezh and Houston, in Edinburgh and Shanghai for just this reason, not simply to stay fit and to burn off the pasta and the pints, but for his own peace of mind, his psychological well-being. It was different today, just as it had been on the afternoon of Martha's call, when Kite had immediately left the cottage and run for 7 unbroken miles, memories of Xavier erupting with every passing stride. The stillness of the morning was the stillness of dawn at the Bonnard Villa in France 30 years earlier. The 18-year-old Kite sneaking back to bed after a stolen night with Martha to find Xavier passed out in his room, a bottle of Smirnoff tipped over beside him, a cigarette burned down to the filter in his hand. The rising sun was a memory of Ali Eskandarian smoking a Cuban cigar in the gardens of the house, laughing uproariously as Xavier lost to him once again at backgammon. The pain in Kite's lungs was Strawson and Billy Peel in the safe house in Mougins, master spies urging Kite to greater and greater acts of treachery against his friend. No matter how hard he tried, whatever tricks of mental discipline he summoned, Kite could not shake off the memories. They were as clear to him as home movies projected onto the Sussex hills and the English sky. He was suddenly a prisoner of a summer 3 decades earlier, when his life and that of Xavier Bonnard had been inverted by Box 88.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Charles.
I should have explained that his friend Xavier has died in the present day as a man of 48, and so Kite is off to his funeral that morning, so he's thinking of what went on.
It's hinted at. It seems to come across loud and clear. A lovely world exclusive from Charles Cumming, forthcoming book, Box 88, published in October. You mentioned Dominic Cummings a bit. You've mentioned the heroism or the admiration you have for those that work in the field of espionage, who have a sense of national pride, of loyalty, of patriotism. In your 5th novel, Trinity 6, you wrote about the discovered 6th member in the Cambridge spies ring. What do you feel about those who are traitors to their country, those who do not have a sense of patriotism, loyalty, and duty?
Are you saying that Dominic Cummings is a KGB mole?
No, I'm not saying that at all. I don't know why I mentioned his name, but you mentioned him earlier, and he broke the rules, and we all have views about that.
I think, again, I don't know if this is naivety, but I used to think, and you and I are broadly speaking the sort of same generation, that people in political life They were self-serving to an extent. They were ambitious. They were capable of going on to the 9 o'clock news and telling a fib or two, sort of seeing Tony Blair for details. In fact, I think Blair and Campbell, that era is what changed everything. And nowadays, the lies seem to be bolder. They're more like kind of Putin's lies. They are, I'm wearing a white shirt, like I'm wearing a black shirt, but Putin would just say, no, it's white, and look at you as if you're crazy to think that it's black. And obviously Trump and all the rest of it. If you don't agree with them, then you're brainwashed. If you say something that is accurate, it's fake news. So that's a new thing. But to answer your question about patriotism and traitors, then I sort of hold them in contempt unless the impulse is to, as you look at somebody like a Gordievsky, for example, the impulse is to free his own people from the grip of communism, from the sadism of the Soviet experiment. And I think that Oleg Gordievsky is a heroic figure. But if you asked a Russian about Kim Philby, they might say the same thing. But for all of his ego and his ruthlessness, Gordievsky was, I think, on the side of the angels, in the sense that he believed in freedom of expression and democracy, and he was fighting for that. He was risking his life for that. I don't believe that Philby was deeply committed to communism, for example. I think he was deeply committed to Kim Philby and to feeling superior to the people that he manipulated. I think McLean was more of a communist, more of a dyed-in-the-wool Marxist, in the way that sort of someone like Jeremy Corbyn is. This kind of lunatic idea that you can make the world a better place by injecting it with Marxist socialism. But I mean, even Snowden, I know that some people drool about Snowden, but I think he was reckless. And I think the fact that he's had to seek shelter from this gangster psychopath in the Kremlin for the last however long it is, shows you the sort of man that he is. He risked lives by exposing what he did. He didn't think it through. And he had that kind of, you sort of see it a little bit with the woke Taliban these days. It's like, I know best, even though I'm 23. And I'll just do what I want, and the consequences can go hang. So yeah, I don't have an awful lot of time for him either. I think he should face the music, or at least be making some effort to fight against what the many crimes and misdemeanors that Putin has committed while Snowden's been living on his dime.
The previous golden age of espionage fiction was obviously born out of the Cold War. Fleming, Le Carre, all that. We seem to be edging towards a new geopolitical paradigm between Russia, between China, between states under Trump, where we seem to be heading towards a rather warmed up version of a Cold War. Do you feel that this is a fertile field to be writing a new form of espionage fiction?
Yeah, I do, and particularly, I mean, Putin is, in one respect, and people like me, is a gift that keeps giving, because he's whether it's Skripal or Litvinenko or any number of ghastly things. All of those things are hugely interesting from the point of view of fiction. But the larger political consequences of his actions are ghastly, and I think it was quite interesting just the reaction to the Russia report, but also what's going on with China at the moment. That I think the read on Russia is that it's a declining power with an economy that's going nowhere, whereas China is very much on the rise, and Xi is still in his 60s and could be around for a very long time, and seems set on the Hanification of Hong Kong. Taiwan will be next. Certainly Xinjiang is already in his sights. And there's a very great danger from China in the West, simply because of money, and also actually because of surveillance and impact on. Let's take an example. If I did down tools as a novelist and become a activist about Xinjiang, there's absolutely no question that I wouldn't have my emails hacked and all sorts of things from my past sort of churned up. I mean, they would just come after me, as they would go after anybody who confronts them, large or small. But you see it culturally. There's so much Chinese money in Hollywood, for example. There's so much Chinese money everywhere. in Africa as an obvious example,
Mhm.
that pushing back against them is very, very difficult. And from an individual perspective, because one's salary is going to vanish, for example, or at a political level, the consequences could be very grave indeed. I mean, you see this all the time. They know the power that they have. If you do this to us, you will face consequences. And as I said at the beginning of our conversation, I despise Trump, but I think on China, he's probably been more right than he has been wrong, and that somebody needs to say, this aggression will not stand. And that I think if there was a kind of globally united front against China on things like Hong Kong and Xinjiang, it would be effective. But if you allow this bully to keep, rampaging around the world doing what he wants, then there's going to be trouble. And don't get me wrong, I mean, the Chinese would say, but what about America? And America has behaved appallingly in the last 20, 30 years in Iraq and Afghanistan and so forth. But this is the problem that we're facing. And I think the grip that the Chinese have on universities here, for example, or is worrying. We're going to have to do as we're told, and that's a very humbling and potentially very dangerous situation to be in.
Yeah,
and to answer your question, really interesting to write about. So, Kite 3 I think is going to be a book about some element of Chinese interference and global political cultural dominance.
Have you improved your internet security?
No, I'm screwed.
If they come to you,
I'll have to have guard dogs and no internet. Firewall won't do it. I'll have to revert to. I'll have to have I don't know, smoke signals or a pigeon or something.
Exactly. You will get back to pre-20th century electronic tradecraft in order to write and get your manuscripts to your publisher.
Exactly. Yeah. No, that's the other thing. I mean, a manuscript, if you keep it online, that could vanish in a click of a finger.
Exactly.
Yeah, anyway.
Hard copies and dead letter drops. Perhaps we're going back to the old school. Let's end up with a couple of your non-writing initiatives, which is, as I mentioned in the intro, you're one of the trustees of the Pierce Locker Memorial Scholarship Fund, providing tuition fees for the Yates Summer School in Sligo. What is this, and how did this come about?
Pierce was a great dear friend of mine who died 15 years ago, and he was a lawyer, but also a great book lover, a learned man. He's the only person I've ever met who's read and understood Finnegan's Wake. And he loved Yeats, and he'd been to the summer school. So his sister and I started up the trust, the charity, and for subsequent years we sent scholarship students to this wonderful summer school in Sligo in the west coast of Ireland to study. Obviously, it hasn't happened this year because of COVID. But we also actually have helped with writers and artists during lockdown who couldn't be furloughed, for example, who needed financial assistance. So it's been slightly broader than Yates this year. That's what that is.
And if anybody listening is interested in this, how can they get in touch with you? How can they find out about it?
The best thing to do would be to contact me on Twitter, I think. Yeah, and ask me to follow them, and then we can get into a messaging thing.
Jolly good. And you're very active on Twitter. And then finally, who was Jose Raul Capablanca, and why is there a Memorial Chess Society?
Paul, I'm ashamed that it's amazing you don't know who Capablanca is. He was an extraordinary chess player, Cuban grandmaster, one of the great chess players of all time, the sort of the Kasparov, the Magnus Carlsen of his day, who played with great flamboyance. It was said that he was playing in a tournament once in Havana, and a beautiful woman walked into the room while he was in the middle game, and he was so taken with her beauty that he could no longer concentrate, and then he subsequently married her. Anyway, when I lived in Madrid a long time ago, I played a lot of chess. So when I came back to London, I thought I want to continue playing chess. So I gathered together a bunch of middle-aged fools, almost all men, and we meet. We used to meet about 4 times a year and have tournaments, and now I'm ashamed to say it's mostly online. We played a lot of Capablanca online chess on chess.com in the last three months. But I love the game. I love the romance of the game and the sounds, and there's nothing more satisfactory than sitting in a beautiful room with a beautiful Staunton chess set with a vodka martini and a chess clock and a good pal across the table. It's my idea of heaven. So it's ludicrous that it's on Wikipedia, but that's what it is.
I did drag it off Wikipedia. We've never spoken about it, but I had to ask. Martinis, you mentioned the word martini. Which way do you veer, shaken or stirred? It has to be asked.
Well, they say that you shouldn't shake them, that it ruins some molecular structure in the vodka. But obviously, it's much more fun to but I make a martini, not every night, but my wife and we quite often sit down and I always have it dry with a twist. I get olive has no place in there, and dirty is an absolute disgrace. But a good vodka, cold. I mean, obviously Duke's in St James's is the place to go. They limit it to 2. They won't serve you a third martini because they know that you'll do something terrible to your neighbours. No, I love a martini, and they that classic thing, obviously, that Russians have known for years, that it just gives you that pop, livens you up, little heart starter, and then the more you drink, the heart starts to stop, I suppose.
I can't think of a better place to end an interview with you, brilliant espionage fiction writer, discussing your perfect martini. Charles Cumming, thank you so much for coming to join us here on the Lockdown LitFest.
Well, it's great to see you. Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
Well, it's lovely to see you too. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Charles Cumming, latest book coming out is going to be called Box 88. It's published in October. It features Lachlan Kite. And if you haven't discovered the previous 10 novels, I commend them all to you. It's a great way to track Charles's career from start right bang up to date. I frankly can't wait for the one that comes after the next one, which is the one on China that Charles has just talked about. We have to wait probably 2 or 3 years for that. Is that about right, Charles?
That sounds about right, yeah.
Sounds about right. As ever, thank you for joining us. Look after yourselves, take care, and as ever, from all of us here at the Lockdown LitFest, including Charles Cumming, cheerio.